Ben, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Stephan. Great to be here.
Yeah, Ben, so I've been following your work. I enjoy it. I think you do a lot of great work in terms of challenging the green agenda and some of your written work, as well as I have seen a couple of your YouTube videos as well. So, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself, just briefly, in terms of what your focus is nowadays, in terms of what you're writing and speaking about?
Yeah, well, the green agenda is this quite a broad thing, and in the past, I think there was much more of an interesting discussion about what the green agenda was. It was sort of looked at the history of the green movement and was quite sort of clear about trying to get to the bottom of what kind of world Greens want to create. But in the 2000s, I think that sort of I say it sort of descends to science, right? That people were very interested in what science says, and skeptics and people who wanted to sort of ask questions about the green agenda were harried into accepting science as the only vehicle for that discussion. Now, okay, we can have the technical debates about how much climate change is happening and what its causes are and what the consequences are, and those are very extremely important things to discuss. But there's a gap in the market, so to speak, for that more old-fashioned view of looking at environmentalism and the green agenda as a political thing, aside from its technical and scientific claims. So that's why I started writing on. That mainly took the form of a blog, and then later on writing a few more articles with different people. I've been producing a few videos, and for a while I worked for Godfrey Bloom, who I think you've interviewed before. Who was it was great fun to work with, and who brought lots of ideas to the criticism of the green agenda, and he was very sympathetic to that view as well. And what I think what he used to say is the green issue is a political dynamic. He used to say we need, and he was we were very much agreed in the need to unpick what Greens claim, because it's not just like Greta saying how people are dying, and that's the whole truth of the matter, and that, so therefore something must be done to stop all these people dying. I say, if you look not far beneath the surface, they want to reorganize society. And it's not clear to me that that's going to produce any environmental benefit whatsoever, even if climate change is happening, even if quite radical climate change is happening. And as other people have said, I think maybe they said it too forcefully in this respect. They're green on the outside and red on in the middle. They're communists in this green camouflage, which is a fair enough criticism, and people shouldn't be afraid of making that. But I think there is more complexity to it than that. But we can't take their word for it, and we can't take scientists' word for it that they're just acting in good faith on the basis of science either.
Of course. And as you rightly say, a lot of the debate and the online discussion is this idea of, oh, the science is settled, and therefore now we need to do all of these economic central planning things. And there's not enough of a discussion about the political and economic ramifications, because just because the science says certain things does not necessarily mean this is the economic answer, because they're very different, aren't they?
Yeah, they're very different, and so I mean, one of my favorite examples is, I mean, they're so keen on banning the car. They've put banning the car far ahead of delivering any sort of anything that can sort of reduce CO2 emissions in any meaningful way, right? So, but they have, and they sometimes pretend there are like for like replacements for cars like EVs, right? But EVs are going to cost people the better part of a year's salary, perhaps more for quite a lot of people. A lot of people depend on, like, the economics of car ownership, certainly in the UK, probably elsewhere as well, are such that I could pick up before the green agenda really started going. I could pick up a second-hand car, maybe 10, maybe even 15 years old, for maybe a week's wages, maybe 2 weeks' wages, right? And then I could get it legit, I could get it roadworthy for not very much money, and and that would enable my whole family transport. So someone who's got a couple of young kids, they maybe got elderly parents or other elderly relatives they need to look after. They could be, or they could have transport, and it could be their holidays as well. Let's not forget the leisure opportunities that are created for or almost nothing in historical terms, just a few weeks worth of work, and so denying that opportunity to people is probably going to have a much greater consequence for them than any sort of claimed damages to their lives from storms. From even if you multiply the number of storms 10 or even 100 times, perhaps that's unlikely to interfere with their lives in any meaningful way. But the Greens, I argue, are worse than climate change for people, because now that family cannot take its children to its sports activities and to its social events. It can't go and visit grandma at the weekend because the public transport is always going to be far too expensive for most people to afford on a regular basis. It means they can't take their relatives to hospital and other appointments. I mean, it's just that they're imagining a utopia in which there is abundance, or they're promising a utopia in which there is an abundance, which, as we're seeing now through prices and supply crises and so on, it just is not going to be delivered. And so, I think green policy is worse than climate change policy is worse than climate change, and that's the future we need to watch out for.
Very well made points. And I'm curious, Ben, as well, in terms of your focus, are you focusing mainly on the UK, or are you seeing yourself as commentating and writing about the global green agenda, would you say?
So I must make apologies, because sometimes I do speak too much to the UK audience, or too much to the European, or even perhaps the Anglosphere audience. I try to keep a balance between those things, and but it's very tricky when the sort of what you experience of green policy is direct. It's on your doorstep. It affects your life personally, but it very much is a global movement. It's an attempt to build institutions above democratic control, or above the level of a nation state, such that the nation state is essentially obliged to this sort of to these global institutions, and so ordinary people have no access to that decision-making process, and I think that's part of what we need to unpick with green ideology and with green politics, is that they've had designs for global political institutions that use the environment as the source of their political authority, and ideas about how the environment is being degraded as the source of their political authority. They've been doing that for a very long time. So if you go back to the late 1960s, really picking up in 1972, there are uh, attempts to use simulations in exactly the same way, forecasting the collapse of society, the collapse of civilization, not on climate change, but in exactly the same way that they now use climate change as the story, to urge um, hugely significant changes to politics and to society and to the economy, all of which predictions, by the way, have failed. So this is an ideological movement that has survived. It's the failure of its claims to truth, to science. It's predictive. It claims to have authority in science, but all of its testable scientific claims have failed, and they failed pretty early on. So famously, people like Paul Ehrlich were saying that Britain there would be no Britain in the year 2000. and that India would be dissolved, or I'm not entirely sure. I can't quite remember. But these predictions all failed, and they were all designed around these simulations and these prognostications. If you can find it online, it's a really amazing video in 1972 at the launch of the United Nations Environment Programme, which is a project of some green billionaires, almost precisely the same kind of billionaires that we've got doing this stuff now. And it looks like the only thing that has really changed, apart from the clothes and the quality of the cameras, because it was all shot on film, is the issue of climate change. So you've got all the world leaders lining up, apart from the Soviet Union, incidentally, interestingly perhaps, all the world leaders standing up to say exactly the same thing. We've got N months to save the planet. We've got 2 years to save the planet. If we don't do it now, then we're all going to perish. So that global that momentum towards global political institution building has not faded, but the story has. The scientific claims have. And I think we've got to be cognizant of that.
Yeah.
We've got to remember that.
And as you say, there have been many catastrophic predictions made for decades now, and these people seem to not lose credibility over it. So they make this crazy prediction, and even well-known politicians, so even in the US, AOC has made this prediction that, I can't remember, it was something very catastrophic that it's going to happen in 12 years by 2030, and then that date will roll around, and why are they not losing credibility? Is it that they are not being challenged on this, that nobody's criticizing and saying, wait a minute, you said this, in 2018, you said this, but now it hasn't happened by now. Or you said this back in 2000 and it hasn't happened by now. What gives?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe the one answer is that they have sort of ultimately set themselves up as the source of authority and credibility, right? So, and I mean, you can't just declare yourself the source of all authority, of course, but there is, it's hard to give a number to it, but there are just immense resources available to that movement. I mean, it's unstoppable because the United Nations Environment Programme, as I mentioned in 1972, was bankrolled essentially by the Rockefellers. I don't want to get conspiratorial about it, but it was the likes of them, Maurice Strong, who was a Canadian oil tycoon, who was very much this sort of global political player who went around sort of forming all the agreements. So, and even today, a lot of the research I've done shows that there would be no green movement whatsoever anywhere in the world without the backing of really, really, really wealthy individuals, and only a couple of dozen of them, right? So for the biggest one we've come across so far is Jeff Bezos, who's created this Earth Fund of I think $10 billion, which creates through which he funds various NGOs. And so behind every big outfit that's lobbying every single government at every single level, the local governments, we found staff being placed in local council, senior parts of local government and offices being placed by NGOs, right, to sort of deliver, I don't know, anti-car policies. This is in Britain. The same is true in the States, where billionaires such as Mike Bloomberg, very much an anti-fossil fuel guy, anti-car guy. He uses a lot of his money to tell you that you can't drive. Or that this city or that city should become car free, but he has got 2 helicopters and 3 or 4 private jets. So there is an awful lot of money coming from these billionaires billionaire philanthropists who think they've got a better idea about how society should be organized than anyone else. Now, I'm careful here. I don't think it's a grand scheme of billionaires, like the guy in Simpsons, sort of the archetypal villain. I just think that they
Mr.
want to
Burns and stuff.
secure
Yeah.
their Mr. Burns. That's it. Yeah, yeah. I don't think. I think that they just want to secure their legacy because there are these new hyper accumulations of capital, like BlackRock and the others that are behind that these fortunes that billionaires have amassed, which makes them slightly different from their predecessors. And I just think they're more they're vanity projects essentially. And there is a sort of movement that has developed to service that need, that desire. Essentially, in a few hundred years ago, it would have been statue builders, right? But now it's this sort of ecosystem of NGOs that depend in turn on the benevolence of billionaires, right? So they say, well, we'll help you solve this global problem, this intractable global problem, and everyone will remember you as this amazing man who saved the planet. I think that's the real dynamic, rather than necessarily um, plots. But into the bargain, and I would point it out, um, the likes of Bloomberg made huge amounts of money out of lockdowns and a lot of the adjacent policy agenda, the climate agenda. And so I think we need to look at that. And if it's not a distraction from your question, I'd point out I made a video recently which looks at a couple of billionaires. In fact, it was British billionaire Christopher Hone and Mike Bloomberg, um, who financed the ESG movement, which is this sort of group of shareholder lobbyists. And over that time, over the mid 2010s to the end of lockdowns, they increased their portfolios by this extraordinary amount of money. And they were very active in persuading companies, well, not persuading, forcing companies to adopt ESG policies and at the same time were running campaigns that sort of pushed investors towards ESG in ESG products. So I think there is an element of profit making in that too. So I'm not ruling that out either. So I'm saying, on the one hand, statue building, and on the other hand, it's just great investment, or it was a good investment, to
Right. It's a good point you
fund
make, and I
green
think it's
NGOs.
interesting because and it's interesting because you there's one angle of just when it's a government mandate, right? So governments are regulating and saying, no, it must be this much renewable or this much wind and solar, and we don't like, you know, coal and natural gas, as an example. But there's another critique, which is saying, oh, well, it's actually the market, right? So there's sort of people who are coming out and
Mm.
saying this idea that, oh, see, it's not even government regulation, it's the market deciding. But in reality, there's this weird dynamic where there are these big funds or big money management companies, so the BlackRocks, the Vanguards, the State Streets of the world, where they essentially, because so many people are stacking in ETFs, basically they're buying ETFs, these large companies get a big say into what happens in the companies they invest in, because they typically get a seat at the board, or they may say, okay, and then this person can sort of dictate how the company grows or what investments and projects get taken up. And so it's really interesting because for years we've heard almost the opposing argument as well, right? So you hear this argument from the green people as well. They say, oh, look, for so long it's been the oil companies who are funding the propaganda against the
Mhm.
science, and won't the people just listen to the scientists because they're saying we need to stop the emissions and decarbonize and all of these things. But it's very easily forgotten that there's all this money in the green world as well, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you make several points there, but to the first one, I would say, the use of corporate governance, so to speak, as in reality, government policy. I mean, the UK government is completely complicit in using the financial markets to execute what it could not deliver by legislation, right? So and you can see that in the Bank of England, I could go into the work of the Bank of England to develop ESG metrics, particularly focused on the E, so as to starve. I mean, it's explicit. That the intention to use the financial markets to restrict capital to fossil fuel companies as a explicit goal. They did, but because they knew if they passed a law saying thou shalt not buy petrol, or that prohibited the market, then they would just be out of office within a few weeks. But if it's sort of done, organized on the basis of the market, exactly as you'd said, um, uh, then it's my money, my choice, and it's all these people making their own investment decisions, not people who have been prodded into making these decisions. And I think there's an investor in the States who's just set up a new fund, which is going to counter this. That's going to say, unfortunately, I've forgotten his name.
Vivek
Do you know the
Ramaswamy,
guy?
I think so. It's like
Right.
this idea of I can't remember the exact name of the company, but that's one of the points I've heard he has made, which is this argument of like the Vanguards, the State Streets, and the BlackRocks of the world are controlling a lot of companies. But the irony, this is the point he's making, is that basically they are pushing companies in a direction that the underlying investors of those funds would not agree with. So, as an example, you might just be a firefighter or a policeman or something. And your pension money is being invested by the Vanguards, BlackRock, State Streets, and some of these other fund managers, and they're driving it in this very greeny ESG
Yeah.
direction. But you, the average guy on the street, didn't want that. You just wanted to be able to buy a cheap car, as you said, to be able to take your family out or to feed your family, to drive to work. And so there's this big injustice there that I think a lot of the Zoom class laptop employee, the people who can just work on their laptops and work online, they don't see that because they don't have enough of a connection out to the real world and people who are actually doing
Yeah.
the jobs that are not just on a laptop.
Yeah, and that really speaks to the other point you made about the alleged fossil fuel funding, because it doesn't exist, right? The guy, I think, used the example of the firefighter, and he's got his pension, or in Britain there's a lot of state sector pension, state people who worked in the public sector who had these funds, and they were approached by like the likes of Greenpeace, or someone saying, "Hey, all of your pension, all of this pension fund is in Exxon and BP and Shell, and you've got to divest, otherwise everyone's gonna hold you responsible for destroying the planet, right?" And then they put it to the fund holders. They say, "Well, should we move this into an ESG, to remove all the money into an ESG companies?" And so your firefighter there may be saying, "Well, hold on, this sounds a bit shonky to me." But what's going to happen is that he's going to be overwhelmed by all of the, or either all of the other members, or some of the organizations that intervene in that process. So these organizations, the green organizations funded by the interests we've already described. There's quite a number of them who will just sort of overwhelm that criticism. There are no counter movements that exist funded by big oil, right? To provide individuals, ordinary people, with the information about what ESG is, and how it will or will not help to solve the climate crisis. So that guy is completely on his own, and the story of the oil funded denial machine, or propaganda machine, whatever, is just a myth and a lie. I mean, if you look into it, and a number of those organizations have made these claims, and they've pretended to, they've claimed to have done research linking, conservative think tanks to interests like the Koch brothers, or something, and then it just amounts to these dribbles of money. Maybe a few 100,000 for a year for for 5 or 6 years for a range, for that think tank's range of outputs. Whereas if you count the money that's available to green NGOs that green, it's just orders of magnitude greater. I'm at least 3 orders of magnitude greater. There's absolutely billions funding the climate change movement to intervene in the market in this way, and there isn't anything on the other side. It's totally
Of course,
asymmetric,
yeah.
and I think that's
Yeah,
going to
and
have
on the
economic
topic then
consequences.
of
Oh, sorry.
pushing back, yeah, and on the topic then of pushing back, so I can imagine that maybe this is a hypothetical world, but hypothetically, should there not be politicians who are trying to push back on that? And maybe we're starting to see some of that now, but I'm curious your view. If you just look at this whole energy debate, green debate around the world, why is it that we're not seeing more politicians who are actually talking about this and actively, proactively trying to push back?
So again, it's quite difficult to get a global picture again because I only speak English as well, so I can only speak about the Anglosphere in the main. So there's been a like a hollowing out of democratic politics across the West. Like since the Cold War, it doesn't really it doesn't there hasn't been a difference between political parties, and there's been a historic detachment from the public. The government has sort of detached, and all political parties have somewhat detached from the public, and this green agenda in the UK, and I apologise for that being British centric again. The the rise of the green agenda coincides with so the green agenda is going like this. The number of people voting was falling for a long time. So people were not engaged in politics, and at the same time you've got the institutions like the European Union being built, and you've got the UN, especially in the post Cold War era, the UN sort of really seizing the moment and in sort of capturing policy agendas and political agendas, and I guess people just sort of thought, well, that's okay. The UN, and you've got experts doing their job, and you've got the NGOs, the lovely NGOs who are just trying to make everything nice. And so no one really noticed that there was quite a fundamental political change going on. There was some degree of utopianism, and quite irrational ideas were being planted in the top strata of political establishments. And so, yeah, I think we're seeing the fruits of that degeneration coming to bear now. When so famously in Germany, well, not famously, in Germany now, we're seeing people warning that critical industries are about to go under completely. Germany's all but sacrificed its auto industry. Of course, this is sort of marred by the point I'm making is somewhat mooted by the fact of the war. But the other fact is that Germany chose its energy path, right? And it was saying that it could be self sufficient in wind and solar PV, and isn't able to. And Donald, this is something that Donald Trump was warning them of, I believe, a few years ago, that they were increasing their energy dependence on Russia. So the green movements, so the green agenda has hit something of an obstacle in that now European, in particular Western European countries, are unable to say that they built the green infrastructure that they built was not dependent itself, did not itself increase dependent on fossil fuel imports, right? So the green agenda, all it has done is exported manufacturing to the east and materials production to the east. And I mean, that's great for people elsewhere. I'm sure it's helped lift a lot of people out of poverty. And in global terms, it's probably a good thing. But it shifted its energy production elsewhere as well, and then claimed these are European countries across the board, they claimed that they had succeeded in reducing their emissions. Look, they claim we have decoupled resource use and economic growth, but it was just fantasy because as we can see now, you're not making anything and you're exporting all. Now you're in this moment of crisis. So I think that's going to create some realism, certainly in Europe, where they have just sort of reclassified natural gas as green energy, much to Greta's annoyance. Right, she's having
And for
a little
years after they
strop
had been
on.
going against gas for years, now they've turned it around. And I think it's very interesting you point out as well with Germany, because they had put in a massive amount of money, effort into trying to go renewable. And this is now coming back. And I suppose there'll always be arguments about exactly what's caused this problem recently. They'll even with that, I think last year in Texas with the failure in ERCOT, there were all these different competing stories about what was the truth of the matter. And, people were saying, oh,
That's right.
see, at first there was a blaming of the wind and solar. Then it was sort of saying, oh no, the fossil fuels failed. But then there was also an argument that because of all this environment, they weren't able to winterize or actually sufficiently upgrade their grid to protect the fossil fuel uh, energy generation. And so it's kind of, yeah, I'm curious if your view on what's going on in Germany in terms of how much of a percent renewable did they go and what caused their problems recently.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact proportion actually, but they announced the closure of their nuclear power stations in the wake of the Fukushima accident. Even though it actually, in if you take a step back, it was a vindication of nuclear energy. I mean that I think that power plant is older than me. Certainly, I think significantly older. I think it's a 50s or 60s design, if not a 50s or 60s building. So it withstood a tsunami. Yes, the top came off, but it withstood a major catastrophe. So Germany, I think at the last record, it was coming up to have it. It was getting close to having spent €500 billion on green energy, solar, and wind. And yeah, as you say, it has very little show for it. And yeah, so similar to the case in you mentioned in Texas. It's there. This the problems, the catastrophe was encoded in that agenda. Like this is as soon as you hit a bump in the road, the whole car falls apart because that's the nature of green policy, I guess. Like that you could have, it should have been possible to predict that there was going to be an energy crisis caused by maybe conflict in Europe, or maybe an economic situation, or any number of things, that there should have been contingencies for. So, although I don't know what the proportion is. I think that, yeah, that's coming to a big explosive point, and we'll see that in the next few months, if not the winter.
Sure. And just turning back to UK politics as well, obviously where you're based, what are your thoughts on Boris Johnson's, let's say, tenure and his thoughts around net zero? Because I think he was, even though being a conservative, he unfortunately kowtowed a little bit and went for the whole green policy. So, what are your views on what he was saying? Did it make any sense at all?
Yeah, I think that's a better example of what I was just trying to say, actually, because there are Greens now trying to say, oh, he's been ousted because he turned a blind eye to sleaze in his party, and he broke the rules, and this, that, and that's why he's lost the confidence of the party, and the public. whereas people perhaps more on my side of things are saying, well, look, he's backed the green agenda, and now people are facing extraordinary rises in bills. I threw it 3 or 4 times the amount for energy that we were paying a few years ago, and it's, that was already an increase. So he's very much, to most people's view, he has very much put a globalist green agenda ahead of the public's interests. He said, he claimed we were going to be the Saudi Arabia of wind. He said green is great, green is good, green is right. This was really very much the flagship policy of Boris Johnson, who's a man who wasn't content to have just delivered what everyone knew he was there to do, which was deliver Brexit. He's a man who needs very expensive grand projets to identify himself with. He needs totems to himself. Again, it's a statue thing. It speaks to his vanity. So in the discussions I've been having with people, in the debates and the arguments I've been having with people, I've been pointing out, look, if he had just done what he was supposed to have done and delivered Brexit, and actually, in the words of his predecessor, cut the green crap, if I may say so on your channel.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, if he'd have not gone ahead with net zero, there's a very good chance he would have had the support of a lot of the public, and that would have been enough to have for him to have survived the attacks on him from within his own party, from within the establishment media, and within Parliament. But he put his all of his capital, as it were, in pretty much just the continuity agenda. And it shouldn't be difficult to understand, for a man like him, that people had enough of the EU for more than just the fact of the EU. It wasn't an arbitrary distaste for the EU because it was the EU. It was that we were bored of, sorry, more than bored. People were fed up with technocracy, with being having our interests put second to political projects, big political projects, and the people's interests not being met by ordinary politics. So he could have done very differently, but I don't think any politician is going to learn that lesson. Certainly not his successor, and certainly not from within the Conservative Party. I hope I'm wrong. I hope to God that in a few weeks' time, someone who understands that the green agenda is dangerous and toxic to their own career will turn up. I can only hope.
Of course. And it's also interesting to see that politicians are obviously not a fan of them, but they are trying to have their cake and eat it too in many cases. So previously, if we looked back a few years ago, they would be explicitly telling us, hey, we're trying to stop fossil fuels, or hey, we're trying to make it more expensive. Hey, we're trying to make fossil fuels, and even I think Joe Biden, even maybe 1 or 2 years ago, was saying, yeah, we're going to end fossil fuels. And now they're going to turn around and then, in Joe Biden's case, go cap in hand to the Saudi Arabians and say, "Oh, please make more oil for us." And they're trying to sort of, on one hand, they caused this problem, and on the other, now they're trying to sort of paper it over for now, while still maintaining the overall green agenda.
Yeah, it's a crisis of their own making, and it's amazing to see. I mean, Joe Biden's something else. I mean, it's the whole collapse in microcosm, and he's. I think he was even trying to blame the people who own the pump stations, the petrol stations where people where you fill up. He was trying to say that they were responsible, and then he's blaming. I think even blaming the public at one point, and just this desperate search for blame and for oil, and there was Macron explaining to him that his sort of jaunts around the world are going to be are not going to result in any more oil production or oil or gas, and so there's this. It's a real awakening to the reality of what they've created. I mean, I don't I don't want to sort of be too Joe centric either. I think it's denial across the board. This is a slow motion
Of
car
course,
crash
and I think
in all of the. And
Of course. And I think in some ways, it's what we've seen in recent months is reality catching up with these people because there's
yes,
only so much green propaganda that they can put out, and there's only so much cost of living and inflation crisis that people will take. And I think probably a good example to chat about now and to get your thoughts as well is you're seeing the Dutch farmers, right? We're seeing this big protest
right.
going, and it's in response to almost it's almost like the everyman is rising up against the globalist people who are trying to say, no, we want to control how you produce things. But these people are rising up and saying, no, we're not having it.
I hope so. Yeah, there's Canadian truck drivers too, wasn't there? And there was and very similar in constitution to the Dutch farmers, and of course the yellow vests in France were the sort of precursor to all of this. And I mean, I don't I hope they just get what they demand, because the idea of it turning into revolutions is really ugly. And protracted protest movements are just not good for anyone. I mean, I think it was really damaging to France. But in the case of the Dutch farmers, they're talking about the legislation um, causing the closure of up to 30% of Dutch farms. So, I mean, there are lots of ideas about what's behind that, including land grabs and attempts to force people off the land and return it to nature. But this is making a lot of people have nothing to lose, and so the explosive nature of that seems to have escaped the likes of Biden when they go off. And this is an interesting point I make. I think is that whereas the targets that are made, so we're going to reduce CO2 emissions, or in the case of Holland, in this instance, we're going to reduce nitrogen emissions by so much. As you were saying before, these come with all these sort of aren't we making the world great? Aren't we making the world wonderful? And it will create green jobs, and it will create green economic growth, and this, that, and the other. So they sell all these upsides to the public on the back of this agenda. They say this is going to be this wonderful new green economy, but only the targets are legally enforceable, right? So you don't get any of the jobs. So there's sort of you don't get an organization saying you promised us 100,000 green new jobs, so we're going to take you to court, UK government or Dutch government, and force you to make these jobs. What you get is green organizations. In the case of Holland, I think it's called the environment, the mobilization for nature, I think it was called. They took the Netherlands government to court to force them to implement the nitrogen emissions reductions. This is environmental lawfare, and we see this a lot, climate lawfare, and it's them that's forcing the government's hands, because in many senses the governments don't necessarily want that level of confrontation, but those governments have set the targets. They were lobbied to set those targets by the same organizations that take them to court for not enforcing those. It's a bit like the way the market is used to governance. It's the other side of that, because you see sort of just as every sort of contract has to be legally enforceable, you see the market sort of creating these things, and then there's always the iron fist in the background saying if you do not commit to these agreements, then we're going to smash you. And so I'm probably straying from your point, but the reality of the political ideology is being made, what kind of world it wants to create and how it wants to create it has been made very clear in three very significant countries, in Canada and Holland and in France. and they've used the state to try and stop those protests. But gosh, I hope that it causes some reflection before those strikes or those protests become much wider and start to cause real damage to society.
Of course. Uh, on the topic of just wind and solar and the viability, sustainability, actually economic sustainability of this kind of energy, I've seen all kinds of different critiques of what's going on in terms of wind and solar and how it's being mandated in certain ways, or as we were saying, in an ESG way, it's being mandated. I'm curious if you have any critiques on them or anything around battery technology or things like this that you would want to highlight.
Yeah, I wind and solar are sort of just imagined to be green by this this move. And there's an amazing clip of Boris Johnson with his former chancellor visiting this sort of very kind of fashionable, probably ESG rated energy retailer in the UK called Octopus. They've also got to have these sort of silly postmodern names. Like why would you go to an energy company called Octopus? It's kind of weird. Why not the energy company should be sufficient, right? So they're already very fancy pants. They've got a lot of marketing. They've got a lot of trendy sort of design about them, and they were sort of extolling the virtues of these smart meters. And they were saying, well, you can use these smart meters to help you reduce the amount of energy you use and to use your appliances when when energy is cheaper. So they're going to get time of day pricing. So the more demand there is, and the less energy is being produced by wind turbines, the higher the price is going to be. So if you're poorer, you're going to be on your smart meter is going to beep when electricity is rises above a certain threshold, and that's it. You may not be able to have a shower before you go to work. You may not even have your lights on, because there's no guarantees as to what the price is going to be. So it's all very well and good to talk about these great big ways of producing electricity, but ultimately it's taking us back to the point in time at which your life, your whole day, what you do is organized around the weather, which is hardly the 21st century in as I'd imagined it when I was 10 or something. And that's the reality that's not explained to people. The Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak say, isn't it amazing? You can plug your EV, if you can afford an EV. You can plug your EV in, and then the smart meter will automatically turn on the charger at 2 o'clock in the morning when when no one's using energy. The reality, of course, is that at 2 o'clock in the morning, all of those smart meters are going to be competing for any surplus energy that is on the grid, and so the price isn't going to go beneath a certain point. They haven't seen any of it through. They haven't thought anything through. Haven't thought anything through. Lots of people have been pointing it out to them. Lots of critics in the press and not enough think tanks, but organisations in Britain, such as the Global Warming Policy Foundation, have been pointing this out to them for a long time. But there is no representation of those arguments at the sort of wider intergovernmental level, or the global level, and contemporary politicians are pretty much indifferent to that kind of criticism or debate. They don't really want to have the argument. They just want they just want to appear in nice little cute little videos on Twitter with the trendy energy company saying we're saving the planet and we're doing this, our policy agenda is doing these great things, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. And so I think it's important for everyone who is cognizant about this to talk about it and try to get more people thinking in a rational way about energy, because I really think, obviously, this is mainly a Bitcoin focused show, but I think it's one of those things where, because of the energy use, this energy debate, Bitcoin and Bitcoiners, advocates of Bitcoin, will get dragged into this debate. And I think it's important that we have good arguments and actually are able to articulate why a lot of these things are not making sense. And because why these things are not making sense, because if not, then there is a risk of technologies being banned or regulated. And of course, I think from a Bitcoin point of view, I think it still wins either way, but certainly it'd be nicer if things are legal and understood, as opposed to being forced underground, in a way. Because I think it maybe even like an example could even be just the way people are thinking about nuclear or fossil fuels energy, that because people have weird ideas about them, it's stopping our use of them. And as you were saying, it's going to lead to less and less people who have access to reliable energy. And that might mean, instead of young people who are growing up being able to actually study and learn things, they're now stuck without lights, or they
Yeah.
can't go and advance their knowledge and become a professional in some field or work in a certain field, because they just lost the opportunity because there was just no energy.
Yeah, and there's a growing sort of view uh, from energy realists that people should look into. I think, and if you're interested in those arguments, that points out. So a guy called John Constable is sort of doing this for the GWPF, who I just mentioned as well. And one of the things he's pointing out is that really the amount of energy that a society uses is a reflection of its sophistication. And that's not to say that you can just set fire to a whole tank of oil just for for laughs, and that sort of registers as a more sophisticated culture or society, but that there is something essential that energy allows energy is economics essentially. There is a thermodynamics of the economy, and that if you've got a lot of energy, if you're using a lot of energy, the sophistication means that there's fewer people working in primary production, and there's more people doing websites, there's more people doing Bitcoin, if you like doing those sort of things, right? So it creates all of these opportunities. Whereas if again you're sat around waiting for the weather to change to have your shower or to get ready for work or to charge your car, then that the reality is you're going to be forced, society is going to be forced into a less sophisticated mode of operation. So that's going to be much more manual work, and much more manual labor, and much less surplus, much less profit to go around to do all the nice stuff. That's all the nice things, to make things that are worthwhile, to make life worthwhile. So I mean, greens are easily characterized as hair shirts, sort of very aesthetic, and sort of mean, as it were, and they've done a lot to shake off that image. They've invested a lot of money in, well, people like Greta, and and slick design, and sort of happy videos, and expensive PR. But there is a reality to that denying the abundance of energy and the affordability of energy. Well, just look to your own life and look to the benefits that it is created. Like if you've ever flown if you go on holiday, if you travel, if you visit family in other countries, if you go for a day out, it all requires enormous amounts of energy. And once that's denied to you, that's denying all sorts of people further on in the economy that freedom and that ability too. I think there's a new sort of a realism dawning on the necessity of energy, and that would be great if we can get that idea to hold soon enough, to stop the sort of strange utopian ideas about energy taking hold.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. Listeners, make sure you follow Ben. He's on Twitter, climb8, the number, resistance. I'll put the links in the show notes, and check out his website. It's climate-resistance.org. Ben, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me again, Stephan. Cheers.